Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Living Well with MS webinar, Series 6. I am Alex Holden. I'm the Chief Executive of Overcoming MS, and I am joining you from a very dark and rainy part of the United Kingdom. Thank you for joining today's webinar. So this is our final session for 2025. Today, I am delighted to welcome back Brett Drummond from MStranslate to discuss the latest MS research and highlights from this year's ECTRIMS conference, so the European Committee for Treatment and Research in MS. We'll also be welcoming Karen Campbell, who is a registered nurse, MS researcher, and living with MS herself, who also attended ECTRIMS this year. So it will be fantastic to see you both again on screen. Karen will be sharing her insights and discussing what Brett is telling us from the research and giving us a bit of insight what that means for the MS community. So before we get started, I will run through some housekeeping just to keep the webinar running smoothly. You'll notice that the webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to Zoom to access the recording next week. But because this is a Zoom webinar, you will only be able to see our guest speakers. It is still an interactive session, so you'll be able to ask a question using the Q&A tab on your screen. So please do submit your questions and we will come on to those when we get to our Q&A in the latter part of the webinar. But please note that our speakers we can't comment or advise on any individual circumstances. So please do try and keep your questions generalised so that they can be relevant for everybody. We will also try our best to answer as many questions as possible. We do generally get a lot of questions, so we may not be able to get through them all. If you do experience any technical problems during the webinar, try exiting the browser and re-entering again using the link in your email, which usually sorts out the problem. But we do recommend using a Chrome browser to access the webinar. We've tried to make the session as accessible as possible. So today we're using subtitles, which you may see at the bottom of your screen. You can turn these on and off by clicking the CC option on your screen. And then as you exit the webinar in about an hour and 15 minutes time, you will see a short survey pop up automatically, which we really appreciate your feedback because it makes us be able to target future webinars and future events going forward. So that's the housekeeping. Let's start then with a little bit around ECTRIMS, and Brett and Karen will be joining us in a moment. Many of you have joined our previous webinars with Brett, but for those of you who are new joining today, just to give you a bit of background, the 2025 ECTRIMS was the 41st Congress of the European Committee for Treatment and Research in Multiple Sclerosis. It took place in Barcelona in September. This year, there were more than 9,500 delegates from all around the world came together. There was a huge range of speakers, scientific sessions, educational sessions, networking, and then brilliantly, the Patient Information Day for people with MS to join at the end was the biggest ever Patient Information Day, which we will come on to. So ECTRIMS is a big deal. It's sort of all the key thinkers, all the influencers, the movers and shakers, the neurologists, MS nurses, researchers like Karen. Everybody comes together to share ideas, share best practices, and sort of hear about the latest research studies. So that's what today is about, learning from Brett and from Karen around some of the insights that they were able to pick up, and then also their own interpretation of what that can mean for the MS community. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Brett to our virtual stage to share his thoughts from the conference. Brett, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. We are going to need someone to access. Oh, now I've got screen sharing. Thank you. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks if you've come and listened to these webinars before. Thanks for coming back for another edition. If you're new, welcome. I will introduce myself quickly at the start of this. If you did join the Living Well Live event recently, there will be a little bit of overlap with some of the stuff I'm saying, but I've tried to keep this relatively fresh and new as well, so you will definitely be hearing some new things. So as Alex said, really the focus of this presentation is giving some highlights from the ECTRIMS 2025 conference, which was held in Barcelona I'm told this is what Barcelona looks like. This isn't one of my photos. Unfortunately, I didn't get a lot of time to get outside of the conference, and we'll go through why that is as we're going through. But just to give a really quick insight into MStranslate and who MStranslate is. So this is the team here. Obviously myself looking considerably younger than I do now, but I refuse to stop using that photo. My brother Eric and Dr. Joanna Cobban, who's on board as another science communicator. But essentially, MStranslate exists to take all of the research that's going on into MS and to present it to people living with MS in a way that's easy to understand, but also scientifically accurate, and really to start to bridge the gap that exists between people living with MS and MS research. And Karen will be perfectly positioned to be able to talk about that when she comes on board later as well. But so my background is in MS research and science communication, and so that's why I'm here talking to you today about all of this. As Alex has already said, I can flick through this really quickly, but for those who may not know, ECTRIMS is the biggest MS research conference in the world. Happens every year. This year we had more than 9,500 participants coming from all parts of the MS community, so researchers, neurologists, allied health professionals, industry, and then fantastically, people living with MS as well. Just, I think it's worth giving a little idea of the size of it, and I think Karen again will be able to talk about this later. So I think it was her first ECTRIMS, but this is a massive research conference. So at any one time, there's 10 sessions running simultaneously. In each session, you might have 6 or 7 presentations. We're doing this across 4 days. I think I said this on the Living Well Live as well, but it's far too early in the morning here in Melbourne, Australia, for me to do that maths. But suffice to say, that means there's a lot of research that we're talking about. So my job today really is to try and take some of the key highlights. It's obviously not going to be able to be everything, but we'll try and leave plenty of time for questions at the end and answer as many questions as we can about it. At ECTRIMS, I get to have a lot of fun, for what I call fun, because I get a lot of access in terms of what's going on. So at ECTRIMS, I host the official conference podcast, which is aimed more at the research community, but it means I get to have a lot of fantastic conversations with leaders in the field. But probably more excitingly even for me, with my passion in terms of communicating to people living with MS about these topics. Since 2024, I've run and hosted the Patient Community Day event as well. So we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So in terms of the presentation itself, it's sort of broken into 2 main parts. So I want to go through some research highlights first. We're going to be talking about remyelination and some of the newer treatments that are being discussed. A short focus on rehabilitation and lifestyle factors, a little bit on viral infection, and then biomarkers. As I said, we'll be going through this relatively quickly because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions, but we'll be covering those main topics. And then in the second half, I'm going to be talking about how we're engaging people living with MS in research. So a few different things there. Patient Community Day, which I've already mentioned, launch of Trusted, which happened this year at ECTRIMS 25, and then some MS nursing. This half especially, I'll go through relatively quickly because I think this will be something that will be great once we get Karen on as well to talk through. So I think the biggest research highlight of ECTRIMS 2025 was the release of the phase 2 clinical trial information on CCMR2. So CCMR2 is a clinical trial that was run out of the University of Cambridge through the Cambridge Centre for Myelin Repair and the Cambridge Clinical MS Research Group. And this was a phase 2 trial that many of you may have heard about. I've certainly talked about it before, looking at 2 repurposed medications, so metformin, which is a diabetes drug, and clemastine, which used to be used as an antihistamine in people living with relapsing remitting MS, to see whether or not these compounds could repair myelin damage. And so they'd both shown potential in preclinical and early studies to be able to do that. And so this was the first largish trial of people living with MS to test these. One of the things that I just want to show, and I showed this on the Living Well Live, and let's hope this works again, is just how they went about measuring to see whether or not there was myelin repair in these people, because it's quite an interesting technique. And we have a little animation, so we work, ignore the, we don't need the sound. We work with Cambridge. Oh, let's hope I haven't just frozen the presentation. This is the joy of trying to do this stuff live. All right, let me stop sharing that for a second. We'll get back to the presentation, which I'm going to need to restart. So trust me when I say, so here we go, we'll work on the fly. I might not try that animation again, but essentially what's happening in terms of how they're measuring it is that they're looking at measuring the time taken for a signal to go from the eyeball to the back of the head. So how long does it take for this signal to travel along the optic nerve? So one of the interesting things about the trial was that it actually took them a lot longer to recruit for this than they thought it would. And part of the reason for that is just the effectiveness of new therapies. So they didn't find that there was, hopefully we can see the slides again. I'm not going to try the video again. As many people with damage to their optic nerve as they thought. So it took quite a while for them to find those people. Essentially, what you're looking for is that there will be people that will have, compared to controls, there will be slowing of that signal if there's demyelination. So when you're on the treatments, what they're looking to see is at the end of the trial, does that signal travel more quickly than it did at the start? And so what was exciting about this trial is that they did see a significant effect of metformin and clemistine in terms of improving myelin repair in the people living with MS on the trial. Now, that's great. I want to, and I said this on the previous event, we need to break down a little bit in terms of what this actually means for people living with MS. Scientifically, it's very exciting. This is now the third successful trial that we've had in MS showing that remyelination is possible, which is huge. But obviously for people living with MS, what you are mostly interested in is when is this going to be something that's available? So how close is this to actually being something that we may be able to access? So in terms of the results themselves, that even though it was positive, it was a very small effect. So 1.3 milliseconds was the change in time that it took to travel. In terms of did the people on the trial notice anything clinically while that was on there, there was no clinically meaningful difference. So they didn't necessarily feel any different in terms of all of the measures that were used during the trial. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that, yes, these compounds have the potential to repair myelin damage in people living with MS, but the clinically meaningful outcomes are possibly mostly to do with the fact that the trial only went across 6 months. Most of the people who work in this field will tell you that they think that to see a clinically meaningful benefit, we're talking about a year or 2 years of being on these treatments before you start to see an actual impact on symptoms for people living with MS. So these results don't necessarily mean that it won't happen. It's just that the trial design needs to be extended out for that. One of the things that I think is really important that I mention in this, and I've done a number of talks around this, and I've talked about this trial a lot in the lead up to the results being announced at ECTRIMS, is around how should we be thinking about these medications. Metformin and clemistine, to a lesser extent, are relatively easily accessible. But what the researchers involved in the trial and the general consensus would be around this is that these are not medications that would be recommended for people living with MS to start taking, for a couple of reasons. One, as we've already said, there's no clinically meaningful outcome at the moment, so you're not necessarily going to feel different on the medications, and we don't know the long-term effects. But even in the short term, there were certainly some safety issues that needed to be dealt with. Now, none that forced people off the trial, but still things that are going to impact on quality of life. And when you weigh up, potentially how significant is the benefit of this versus these side effects, that's why there's a recommendation that this isn't something that's going to be recommended at this point. So in terms of metformin, it definitely comes with a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms potentially. So a number of people on trial on metformin experience diarrhea and other GI symptoms. Clemistine has a huge sedative effect, so this is one of the big reasons why it's not really widely used as an antihistamine anymore. So in a group of people who are already dealing with quite intense fatigue, obviously the sedative effect of clemistine is not something necessarily that we want to add on to that. So what are the next steps? I think around this now, when was mentioned at ECTRIMS 2025, there's a few different things that are going to be looked at. The big question now is, do we already have the therapies that are going to be our remyelination therapies? And we just need to think about extending trials, following them out for longer to see, to see these big benefits that we might see? Or are there going to be more powerful remyelination therapies that come through that are going to be better, and we're going to start to see them in the existing trials? The answer is probably both. So I think there will be some follow-up on this trial to start to monitor out further to see, is there ongoing benefits, or do we see a greater change over a longer period of time? But there are lots of other compounds that are also being investigated to be able to do it. The exciting thing around this, I think there's two exciting things around this that I want to finish on in terms of the myelin repair topic. One is that we know it's possible, but we also know that it is how to do trials around this. And this is not a small thing. It's not that long ago that conversations at ECTRIMS were around, we really think myelin repair is possible, but how do we design a trial that's going to capture whether or not it's happening? We now have 3 trials that have shown it's possible, but also to show that we know how to capture and measure this in a clinical trial, which is a big step forward, because it means with any new compounds that might be coming through, we know that we're being able to test them effectively, so we're not going to miss anything. I think the second exciting thing around this, going back to sort of how I framed this at the start in terms of what does this mean for you, is that when we talk to people in the field around myelin repair, the 2 questions are, is it possible, and when are we going to see it available for people living with MS? In terms of the first question, this is not an if anymore. People are very convinced that we will have myelin repair therapies for people living with MS. There's almost zero doubt when you talk to people, they say, yes, this is going to happen. It's just a matter of when. And in terms of the when, people are pretty confident that sort of within the next 5 years, we should start to see a myelin repair therapy. Now, I know 5 years isn't necessarily the shortest amount of time. There's still some, that's still a lengthy period of time. But in terms of getting to that point and the number of steps to jump through, that's quite good in terms of these sorts of things. So, I think that's a really positive thing for me around this, because I think myelin repair is one of the next big steps forward in terms of the treatment and management of MS. So moving forward with that and just going into a few other new treatment approaches that you might have heard about that were also discussed at the conference. So one is the BTKIs. So you might have heard about that. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail with the first 2 of these. BTKIs I would have talked about a little bit on this webinar last year when the tolebrutinib trial results had come out. This year we have the fenebrutinib trial results. Don't worry too much about the names of these. They're just 2 different BTKIs. So these are just a different type of therapy, a different class of therapy where there's been interest in looking at this in MS. And in terms of just explaining these really quickly and the interest around them, is that they've shown now across two trials, both the tolebrutinib trial and the fenebrutinib trial, have shown a positive outcome in people living with progressive MS. Fenebrutinib also showed one in relapsing remitting MS. Now, all I want to go through in terms of this is just explaining why there's some extra excitement about these medications. So you would have seen, if you'd joined this webinar last year, you would have seen me show these figures again. When I started doing MS research 20 years ago, this is sort of a figure that we would see really routinely. So when a person's diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS, the disease is being driven by inflammation, and you have these periods of attacks called relapses, and then disability worsens, and then they go into periods of remission, and then this process goes on and on and on, and then eventually a person might transition into secondary progressive MS. And the big difference being at secondary progressive MS, we just see a continual worsening of disease, and this is driven by neurodegeneration rather than inflammation. Primary progressive MS shown here starts just at this point, essentially, that from disease onset, it's this worsening. So this is how we would think about it traditionally. That picture has changed slightly in terms of what we look at, and so I'm going to show now more how you would see something like this represented, which is going to look slightly more confusing, but we'll walk through it. It looks a little bit more something like this. Now, all we really need to focus on here is the purple, the blue, and the orange. Don't worry too much about the green for now. But so the orange here is this inflammation component that we saw at the start. So we still see that this is the highest earlier on, but it continues on throughout the disease. It doesn't just go away. Importantly, this neurodegeneration, which in the previous slide, if you remember, we said just started once a person had progressive disease, we now know this is going on from the earliest phases of the disease. And then you see the disability worsening over time. What's important about these medications and the earliest trial results from this, which was the tolebrutinib, it's now also been shown in fenebrutinib, is that they saw a positive result in people with secondary progressive MS or progressive MS that didn't have relapses. So essentially very low inflammation. And what this is telling us, and we still need to unpack these results, is that it seems like these treatments do actually manage to target some of this neurodegenerative component. And this is huge because none of the others really do that. All of the other existing therapies that we have are more around the minimizing the inflammatory component of MS. So hopefully now we're having some treatments that may be able to target neurodegeneration, which is big for people with progressive MS, but also going to have benefits for people with relapsing remitting MS as well. So these are exciting treatments that have come out. The fenebrutinib trial results were really just off the back of ECTRIMS. They were released just right around the time, so I've included it in this, but we still need to see the full trial results of that. So we await with this with excitement. CAR T cells, I just want to mention, they're very, very early in terms of how they're being used in MS, but I know there's a lot of interest in it. People have heard about CAR T cell therapies. And so I just want to go through, this is an image around how CAR T cell therapy has been used in cancer, which is where it's come from, similarly to HSCT, which you may have heard of as well in terms of a treatment for MS. MS also started as a cancer therapy. And the process isn't too dissimilar, except now we're taking T cells, which are cells that are in your immune system. T cells we know can be cells that do damage in MS, but in this instance, they're being taken out and they're being engineered in a laboratory to target something else in your body. And in terms of MS, mostly what these are being used for are to target B cells. So not dissimilar to things like ocrelizumab or rituximab, which are B-cell depletion therapies. This is just another way of trying to get rid of those B cells, which we know cause problems in MS. The exciting thing, or probably the advantage of CAR T cells, is we know that they can access the central nervous system better. So in terms of being able to get rid of B cells in the brain and spinal cord, they have a greater access to that. So the idea around this is that they may be better at getting rid of the troublesome cells in the areas where they're causing trouble. This is very, very early. So we've just seen one of the first patients in a clinical trial in the UK go onto a CAR T cell therapy. There are definitely some safety things associated with this treatment, so we need to work through. So this is definitely something where we're going to need to go through clinical trials, understand how this works in people living with MS. But just as another new potential treatment option that's on the horizon, this is also something that's being investigated. So shifting out of the treatment space a little bit, but to talk about viruses, I think, and this is one obviously we can go through, I would have last year and potentially the year before talked a lot about Epstein-Barr virus in terms of what we're learning about it and how it relates to MS. As my one sentence recap, the thinking on this at the moment is that in pretty much every condition, it's impossible to get MS unless you've been exposed to EBV. So it seems like a necessary part of the pathway to developing MS that you need to have been exposed to this virus. Being exposed to the virus alone, however, is not enough to develop MS. 90% of the general population get exposed to EBV at some point during your life. EBV stands for Epstein-Barr virus, and it's the virus that causes glandular fever in people, or infectious mononucleosis, depending on your part of the world. But many people get exposed to EBV without ever feeling sick or having any symptoms. We're learning more, and there's presentation at ECTRIMS around how might this be involved. And so there's some interesting research showing that little bits of the virus seem very similar to little bits of the myelin that gets attacked in MS. And so there's a growing theory here that essentially this may be a case of mistaken identity. So your immune system reacts to the fact that you've got this virus that's infected you. It starts to attack the virus, and as it's doing that, it starts to attack something that it thinks is the virus, but it turns out it's actually part of the myelin sheath. And then that's what then triggers, once that starts to happen, that triggers off a series of events that then lead to MS. That research is all still preliminary, but we're getting some interesting results around what that might be and what those targets might be. Probably more around this, and this is all also very new and things that are being discussed at the moment, is can we target EBV or other viruses as a way of treating MS? So there's been some interesting results around this in a very small number of people. These are isolated case studies from around the world of people living with MS who also have HIV. And what they've seen in those individuals, in some of those individuals, is that when they are put on antivirals to treat HIV, antiretrovirals to treat the HIV, there seems to be an improvement in their MS. Now, importantly around this, and we're going to talk about health literacy at the end, we cannot draw any conclusions from this. This is less than 10 people that we're talking about. So we can't say that this is actually a causation and not just a correlation that would have gotten better anyway. But there is interest in this around, well, could antiviral therapy be potentially a treatment for MS? And so there are now some research projects definitely around the world that are looking at that. We don't have a huge amount of data on that. This is something I would expect we might start to see some things around at the conference next year. But there's certainly some interest in some initial talks around this that happened at ECTRIMS this year. The other thing I want to mention around it was something that was discussed. It's something that continues to be of interest, is just around vaccinations, consensus guidelines, all of this, and it's talked about at the conference again, is that vaccinations are safe for people living with MS. Obviously, in an individual circumstance, if you have any concerns, always talk to your healthcare professional, but high level of safety, and people should be getting vaccinated against COVID, against the flu, against those typical things to help protect against those sicknesses, as we know that those sicknesses can also worsen MS symptoms. This I won't go through, even though I know this is a huge topic, and so if you have questions on this, happy to do it. I talked about this definitely on the Living Well Live broadcast that happened a couple of weeks ago. But rehabilitation and lifestyle modifications was a big topic at the conference. It's, I think, a fantastic thing that this is now something that is discussed every year at the conference. In terms of updates around messaging on this, I'm really only going to talk about the first two. There's always research on exercise and diet that comes through. Definitely an area of interest, definitely both things that can have an impact on MS. But in terms of the first couple of things, I think the biggest change in messaging at the conference this year, it felt like a really big change, even though it's probably been there a little bit all along, is that these aren't late stage issues. So this isn't a thing that, once mobility becomes a problem, start to then think about exercise. The idea now is that all of these rehabilitation strategies and lifestyle modifications are things that should be talked about from the very beginning of the disease and implemented from the very beginning of disease. I think the phrase last year, prehabilitation is better than rehabilitation. Basically, we don't want to wait until function is lost to try and restore it. It's much easier to try and keep something than to get it back after it's gone. And another thing I really want to talk about on this slide is mental health. It's something that I think we need to talk more about in terms of MS. I could do a whole webinar just talking about my personal views on this in terms of why we should talk about it more. We know people living with MS have higher rates of depression, have higher rates of anxiety, have higher rates of suicide. It's something we need to do more about. Pleasingly, it was a big part of the conference this year, having RIMS involved. Again, this is something that is being discussed in terms of through the professional network at the conference around how do we make sure that this is being implemented from the very start. What does our healthcare team need to look like? And I think that's an important thing, is that it's really being discussed now is for people living with MS, you need a team of healthcare professionals around to provide that support. So obviously there's the neurologist who have those interactions with and they're helping to manage the disease, but then it's having access to an MS nurse, which I will talk about in a little bit. Obviously we have Karen joining us who will be able to talk more about that. That has huge benefits. Implementing other allied health professionals, so physiotherapy, exercise physiologists, but also ensuring that clinical neuropsychologists and psychologists are involved in this process as well to help with mental health, and also with cognition, which is a big thing. I talked about that on the Living Well Live. I'm not going to talk about it today. It was a huge topic at ECTRIMS, so happy to take comments on that as well. But I think the important message here for people living with MS is knowing that these are topics that are being discussed at these big conferences. So definitely over the past few years, there's been a shift going to these conferences in terms of, we obviously talk a lot about basic science. We talk a lot about exciting things from the research perspective, but it's also around what are the other things that we can be doing that can help people on a daily basis living with MS and mental health, and shining a spotlight on that and going, how can we make a difference in this space is something that's being discussed. So I think this is the last research highlight that I wanted to go through, is just around biomarkers. So biomarkers, for a really quick sort of definition, are basically anything that we can measure that indicates change over time. So in terms of MS, one of the things that we're really interested in doing is trying to identify, is there something that can tell us whether or not the disease is progressing, that can maybe predict whether or not there's going to be a relapse that's coming, seeing whether other things are changing under the surface. This can also apply to different symptoms. So looking at, are there biomarkers, other things that we can measure that can indicate cognitive changes over time that we can pick up early, sensitive things that we can see that are also non-invasive. Obviously, traditionally, our main way of being able to do this has been through looking at MRI images over time and seeing, is there a change? Are there new lesions? I think most people living with MS would say they'd prefer it if, there could be a simple blood test or something that could give some indication, especially if this could give an indication early so that decisions could be made and maybe we try and stop things before they progress. So there's a couple of ones that you may have heard about. Again, I'm not going to go into too much depth with it, but neurofilament light chain, or NFL, and GFAP are both, and that's, so I should give you the full name for that, glial fibrillary acidic protein, are both ones that are being investigated in terms of things in the blood. So NFL is the one that's had the most research done on it. Essentially, it gets released into the bloodstream when there's damage to the nervous system. And so what you see is when there is an attack or a relapse, you see NFL go up in the blood. And so there's interest in, being able to do this to see, can we work out what's going on? GFAP looks interesting in terms of being potentially a biomarker of more of the progressive disease, so more of the neurodegeneration that we're seeing. These are both still relatively research-based. They're not being used clinically at the moment. There are some people who believe more strongly in NFL and might start to use that a little bit in terms of the clinic. So, for treatment monitoring, so if a person goes onto a treatment, measuring NFL over time to see, is that treatment working? Are we seeing NFL come down because there is no disease activity? And then over time, just making sure it doesn't go back up. And if it starts to go back up, thinking, all right, do we need to make a switch here in terms of the treatment that the person's on? Imaging and digital technologies are another big one in the space. So, are there actually wearable devices? This was another big topic at the conference. Are there wearable devices or phone apps that people can be using to, input large amounts of data on a daily basis, either directly or indirectly just through their activities, that may also be able to provide us information that could be used as a biomarker? So as a very simple example of that, if there were things that were monitoring step counts and activity, can that be used, or would that be a good marker of starting to see if there is a relapse coming or if there's disease worsening? Do you see a reproducible effect in terms of, a person starts to walk less because things are getting worse? That's a very simple example. They're looking at this in terms of many different things, especially in terms of cognition. But I think importantly, just to highlight that there is a lot going on in this space as well, and progress is being made, because what we know is the earlier we can realize that things are starting to change, the better it is. But also, I think the other thing that I want to highlight in this is it's also a little bit around healthcare professionals understanding that this is something where we need to get better, or where they need to get better or have better tools at their disposal. Because I think it would not be an uncommon thing for people living with MS to think that they're feeling worse. They think that there's progression going on. They go to their appointment, nothing's changed on an MRI, nothing seems to be happening, but you can feel it. You know that there's change. And we need more sensitive markers to be able to pick up on that, because generally you're going to understand it better, and it just takes time for other tools to come up. So are there better ways that we can be monitoring this that better align with when you start to feel it? We can also see it and changes can be made. So shifting, and I'm going to go through the second part really quickly because I think I've been talking for quite a while already, and I want to make sure that there's a good platform for Karen and Alex to come back on and talk, and for us to handle a lot of questions. The other big thing around ECTRIMS 2025 was a focus on how do we have people living with MS more engaged in research. I think there is a really clear understanding now across the research community that things work better, things work more quickly if we involve the people who are impacted by the most of it at every stages of research. So in terms of designing research projects, coming up with research questions, obviously being participants and in studies, etc., etc. One of our big ways that we're trying to maximize this engagement coming out of the conference is an initiative that started 4 years ago that, as I said at the start, I got heavily involved in 2 years ago. Barcelona was my second year. But at the end of each conference, on the last day of the conference, there's a 3-hour event where we talk through the highlights that have just happened at the conference. We have a panel of experts from around the world, some really exciting people in terms of real leaders in all of these topics. Full replays are available for Barcelona. We're already in terms of planning for MS Toronto 2026, where we'll be hosting this event again. So if you have thoughts and questions, all of the things that you ask now, considering I'm sort of heavily involved in the planning of the event, things that you ask now and topics that you're interested in, we take on board as we start to plan the event. But yes, you can go and watch everything from Barcelona. The other thing that I wanted to mention in terms of engagement with research, and especially with I think a largely UK audience, one of the other exciting things that happened at ECTRIMS 2025 was the launch of Trusted. So scientists love acronyms and they love coming up with these things. So Trusted is the Trials and Registries Unified Sign-Up Tool for Equitable Discoveries. Now, this is being run out of the University of Cambridge as well. You can look up that website, trusted.org.uk. Essentially, this is just a way of getting people in the UK for now, it's solely the UK for now, more involved in research and being able to give you more insights into the research projects that are happening in the UK for MS, and giving you a way that you can be easily contacted if there are studies available that you are eligible to participate in. So basically, you sign up on a form. Some people will have already done it. This used to be called Consent, or a lot of clinical sites throughout the UK are already involved, but you can sign up even if the place where you are being treated clinically isn't one of the sites. You can still sign up. One form, you sign up, you go through, and then you can be contacted to participate in studies. All of the information is on the website for that. I'm not going to go into detail on this now. The MS nursing session really went through a couple of big things: health literacy, which is a massive thing for me in terms of science communication. How do we actually ensure that people living with MS are accessing the right information and credible information? And this is something that needs to be discussed with everyone, and MS nurses play a key role in terms of this. We obviously want people to be finding out about research and looking up things that may be beneficial, but how do you separate the good stuff from the bad stuff is important. We can talk about that if people are interested, but also in shared decision making. And I think this is going to be something that will be fascinating when Karen comes on, considering her unique perspective on it. But one of the things that I think is really important, again, to highlight that people are coming to these conferences to learn, and learning that there's still more that we can do. I was fortunate enough to record a podcast with a couple of fantastic MS nurses at the conference, and one of the things that they highlighted, which had also been discussed in the session, was there was a study that was done that looked at basically asking people living with MS and MS nurses, what are your top 10 priorities? So people living with MS, what are your top 10 priorities when you're going into these appointments and talking to your nurse? For the nurse, what are your top 10 priorities when you're meeting with that individual living with MS? Not a single one of those 10 answers overlapped. So there was complete, and the MS nurse on the podcast said, for me, that was a real eye-opener in terms of, I might have things that I want to talk about in those appointments, but I need to do a better job of listening, and we need to do a better job of coming together and making sure we're in alignment on the things that are important, because in the end, they're to help the person living with MS. So being able to have those conversations and, I think have a better understanding of how we listen better and understand more around both sides of those situations is something that we're starting to learn more about. So with that, I'm going to stop talking for a while. I'll let Alex come back on and talk to Karen. If you want to find MStranslate anywhere, we're obviously talking about this stuff all of the time, all the links there for the different social platforms. But I'll go quiet for a little bit and then be happy to answer questions. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Brett. That was excellent. You managed to cover numerous studies, numerous updates, numerous pieces of research, and all in a very consumable format. So, thank you. I can see from a couple of the comments that people are finding it fascinating. Really, really appreciate you giving your time, particularly when it's not even breakfast time in your world. Um, Karen, welcome to the screen and lovely to see you again. And welcome. So, some people within the Overcoming MS community will know you already. Do you want to just sort of introduce yourself to the community and then I think share a little bit about what it's like to be in that patient role sort of at the conference, but as a person with MS, because the majority of the conference is not targeted at people with MS, it's targeted at the researchers.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Karen. I am an assistant professor at York University in the School of Nursing in Toronto, Ontario, in Canada. And I came to ECTRIMS because I am also a researcher and a researcher doing work in MS. I actually work with women that have experienced intimate partner violence and looking at what that does to women that also are living with MS. So that was my interest in attending ECTRIMS. And then obviously I have the other side of that of also being a person that lives with MS. And so one, I will say, I know you and Brett both mentioned that there were 9,500 people there. It felt like 95,000. It was an incredible sea of completely overwhelming number of sessions. And what you didn't mention, Brett, was also the number of posters. So on top of all of the actual sessions, there were also research posters, and there were hundreds of those, too many to even go through. So I think that that part is overwhelming, and it's certainly overwhelming as a person. I think it's also interesting to listen to researchers and to physicians and research physicians talking about patients, like patients this and patients that. I think sometimes they forget a little bit, and similar to what the MS nurses found, that people are involved in here. We're not always patients, and we're certainly not always their patients. And so just thinking about shifting that language, I think, was important to me, even talking about people with MS rather than patients, because we exist outside of our lives as patients. So that was interesting to me. I think that the other thing that was important to me, and this might be my background as a public health nurse, was to look at or to attend some of the sessions that were specifically around lifestyle modifications. I certainly was interested in some of the new therapies and drugs. Some of those were completely, and I have a PhD. I'm in healthcare, and I am still, that went over my head in terms of the actual genetics of what's happening. So it was really helpful to attend some of those sessions, and I'd love to talk about them.
Excellent. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I think there's something about, I think the point you're making about being people with MS for a lot of those presentations are data points, particularly when we're talking about a big clinical trial when you've got several thousand people who've been participating. And Brett, I think that really brings the value of the patient community day. Whether actually then, given Karen's points, patient community day is quite the right term, but that's maybe a conversation for another day. But I think that was because there's some quite high profile academics and researchers who are attending that patient community day and are having to present their research and make some interpretations for a audience which is purely people with MS, plus a couple of extras. I do think that gives an extra dynamic. What are your thoughts in terms of where that goes?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been a massive inclusion into the program, and a hugely necessary inclusion into the program. And obviously, I'm biased in that in terms of what I do at MStranslate and what I'm passionate about. Completely agree with the language thing, and this is something, I think this is a listening part of it as well, and something that I learned very early during MStranslate, of shifting the language that I use around this. And there's so many examples of that. You know, you see people, articles in the media talking about someone suffering, they're an MS sufferer, and hearing, when we just hear so much feedback around this is not language we want to hear around what's going on. So yes, our biggest issue with Patient Community Day is people living with MS Community Day is a bit of a mouthful. And also it's not just an MS event now. We also have NMOSD and MOGADs that come under the umbrella that we talk to. But the language thing is definitely a point well made, and something that I think we need to keep pushing and getting across. But yeah, I think that the fact that we have, the people who come up on stage for the panel during that event are really the leaders in the fields on the topics that we talk about. And I think obviously I talk to them all beforehand. I'm sort of involved in picking who those people are. I think what's a really nice behind the scenes part of this that I can share is they are all super excited about being involved. I don't think we've ever had anyone say that they don't want to do it. And this is coming at the end of, Karen, you've just talked about how overwhelming this conference is and busy it is. So everyone is exceptionally exhausted by Friday afternoon, but people are excited to be involved in this. And this is a very genuine thing in terms of we understand that this is something we need to be doing and we're excited to do, because it's also important for them. That is very much the other part of this that we can't overlook. This is not a one-way conversation where this event is about, hey, we're going to tell you about what happened at ECTRIMS. That's obviously part of it. It's obviously a really big part of it. But it's that two-way conversation going back where the MS research community can learn a lot from people living with MS. And it starts to, those conversations guide what the next 12 months, 24 months of research looks like. We
And I'll
get a
say
lot from that.
that particular, and Alex, I know you were at all of it as well, but I would say that afternoon was probably the most exciting part of the entire conference, that it was palpable how excited people were to be there, on whether they were people living with MS, people that were supporting people with MS, wherever they came to it from. I think that it was probably the most exciting part for me. And it was the part that put a lot of really complex things into plain language, like MStranslate, right? That idea of how do we take some of these big complicated things that are happening and what does this mean for people?
I agree that the energy that it felt in the room, and obviously it took place in Barcelona, and the Spanish charities, I think, had clearly done a very good job. There was a huge representation of Spanish speaking people with MS. And actually, even sort of being there and representing Overcoming MS last year, i.e. 2024, I was there on my own. This year there was me, there was Karen, there was a lady called Lucy from Ireland who was brilliant. And she's written a blog about it. But actually, I was also knew so many people had joined online, and I was getting messages from them when they were listening to the presentations about their thoughts. And it was that sort of feeling of we're all in this together, and we're trying to get that message out about clear communications. And I really see Overcoming MS's role in how we get some of that really clear information out to people, particularly obviously in our role around health and well-being and lifestyle, around, okay, this is what the study said, this is what this means for the community. That's what I see our role as being. On that topic, and conscious of time, we probably ought to try and answer some of people's questions that they've sent in. So we were sent a number of questions in advance, and then we've got some questions that relate specifically to some of the topics you were raising, Brett. So maybe if I just sort of go into a couple of those, if that's all right. There was a couple of very specific ones. Around EBV, which you touched on. So do you know if you test negative for EBV, does that mean you don't currently have it, or that you have never had it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Generally, you would pick up whether anyone's ever been exposed to it in these tests. So it's very unlikely, well, not necessarily very unlikely, but you don't necessarily catch it at the time. It's more of a historical thing. Most people are getting exposed to this in adolescence. It's colloquially called the kissing disease, as that's how it's passed on. All of these teenagers sharing their saliva and passing on these viruses. So it should be historical. It is certainly possible that a person will test negative. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean, though, that they haven't been exposed. There's some little things around this. There was a couple in the studies who were also negative, but yeah, generally our thinking on this at the moment is that every person with MS, or the vast, vast majority of people living with MS, have been exposed at some point in their life.
I think
Great,
I think
sorry,
about it
Karen.
like COVID, the PCR tests. The PCR tests will tell you if you have it right now, and the same thing with EBV. But it's likely, like Brett's saying, there's like 90 to 95% of us have already had it. So unless you're getting tested for all the antibodies, it's not really going to tell you. A test isn't going to tell you too much. You can just assume you probably have been exposed.
Yeah. It's more the potential then of looking at vaccinations and things in the future rather than what it tells you to know whether you've been exposed, isn't it? It's sort of where the usefulness of it lies.
Absolutely.
Okay, a couple of other drug-related ones. So someone has said T-cell therapy looks very interesting. Could the mRNA approach be adapted to deliver T-cell therapy in the same way?
So they're slightly different things, if I'm understanding the question correctly. I mean, in terms of the mRNA therapy related things, we have our mRNA vaccines. I don't think we'd use mRNA to try and code for engineered T cells necessarily. But there is some mRNA stuff, I guess, linking to the previous question. Moderna are looking at an mRNA vaccine for EBV and looking to see whether this could be a novel treatment for MS that has just launched in a few sites across the UK. Actually, they've just started doing some things around that. So in terms of mRNA vaccines, that's what's being looked at in terms of MS, but I don't know about mRNA for T cell sorts of things.
Thank you. And then was there any discussion of GLP-1s for use in MS around inflammation?
So, I mean, metformin is probably the main one that we talked about as being part of the CCMR2 trial. There have been discussions of other ones potentially around that, but I would say there's not a huge amount of data. Karen, I don't know if you want to add on to that at all.
Karen, do you just want to say what GLP-1s are? I'm just conscious for people who don't necessarily know. Sorry.
Yes, and this is
Put
the
you on
kind
the
of
spot.
language. I think there was lots of language like this where I was like quickly like trying to go back into my science and then learn things I've never learned before. GLPs refer to weight loss drugs. So you said it's Mounjaro. Is that the name of it usually in the UK?
Mounjaro, yeah.
Mounjaro, and in North America, it's usually Ocrevus, or sorry, not Ocrevus, Ozempic. So Ozempic, and one of those drugs that help you to lose weight. The things that the only thing I was going to add is that some of these trials are still going on in like mice, and so we're still like steps and steps away before this is actually something that you will see getting prescribed to us. And I just think that that's important, but also to recognize that there's been a huge shift. And I think that this was really something that stood out to me at ECTRIMS was around kind of the golden age. I think it was referred to a few times in a few sessions, the golden age of drugs that we're using in terms of Kempa and Ocrevus. I think that was somebody's question there too in the chat, but those drugs being used and how far we've come in a short period of time, because when I was diagnosed 10 years ago, those weren't options. And they were in trials. And so we may see these things, who knows? But what I was going to add was that even though the GLP-1s, we maybe don't have good information around this, and I think this was another question, was around the lifestyle factors, and that dealing with obesity was one of the clear things that came out. So whether it's like it came out in the exercise sessions, it came out in the diet sessions around dealing with obesity, and lowering obesity rates is going to be helpful for MS and MS symptoms. And the other thing around diet, that as a person that follows the OMS way of being for 10 years, that it was really clear that although there's lots of different diets, that the ones that are showing the most significance are those that are in the Mediterranean, that are following Mediterranean type. And specifically what they talked about was no red meat, no sweets, which kind of hurt me a little bit. I will not lie. But no sweets, lots of fruits and vegetables, less processed foods, and and the fish. So thinking about Mediterranean, and again, exercise came up. So while we don't yet know about the GLP-1s, I think it's worthwhile to continue to think about what OMS offers in terms of the support and whatnot for living a healthy lifestyle.
Thanks, Karen. And I think actually you touched on it there. We often sort of just talk in big senses around, oh, yes, it's beneficial for people with MS, but actually that differentiation between progression or reducing progression and the impact on the symptoms can sometimes be two completely different things. And we maybe need to be clearer. And actually, somebody's question relates to that around myelin repair, which Brett, I think, was put in the chat when you were talking about that. And does myelin repair lead to reduced symptoms or reduced progression, or is that not yet known? And then there was a similar question saying, did any new information come out about slowing disability progression?
Yeah, so in terms of the first one, I'd say we probably don't know it. Theoretically, we would assume if we have an effective myelin repair therapy across a long period of time, that we would expect there to be some symptom improvement, because a lot of the symptoms that we're seeing are because of the damage to the myelin that's occurring. So if we're repairing that and making it a lot healthier, then we would expect to see it. But that's theoretical at the moment. We haven't really observed that any real effect on symptoms across the clinical trials, probably just because they haven't gone long enough, other than obviously you have this slight quickening of signal across the nerves in the optic nerve. The second one was on disease progression in general and things around that.
Yeah, any new information about slowing disability progression?
Well, so yeah, I guess in terms of these new therapies that are coming out, the BTKIs, I mean, they're ones that we're looking at that may be able to do that. I mean, that's obviously the goal of all of our therapies that are coming out, is can we actually have an impact on that? I think it's probably more what we're looking at. Traditionally, relapse rate has been a thing that people have looked at a lot and gone, is that what's going on? But maybe that's not our focus anymore. It's not necessarily, because we know that even with that, disease can continue to progress because of that very complicated image that I showed at one point in the presentation, where I showed that there's other things going on leading to disease progression beyond relapses. And so trying to target those components to stop it is probably one of our biggest avenues. But then, I mean, I don't think we can have these conversations without always coming back to, there are things other than pharmacological things that we can be doing to reduce disease progression. So I'm not going to go back on diet and exercise. I think Karen's done a great job with that. But things like smoking, I mean, we know that smoking is a massive thing in terms of disease progression. We know it heightens susceptibility to developing MS in the first place, but we know that it has a huge impact on worsening disease progression. So, quitting smoking at any time, the data has shown us, can reduce disease progression. So certainly some interesting things in new treatments, but there's other things that also have a big impact on that as well.
Yeah, I know our medical advisor, Dr. Johnny White, always says there's the Overcoming MS program, these are the pillars, but actually the one thing that has been proven to have more impact than anything else is stop smoking. I think we should make that a lot clearer. Going back to your beautiful chart, I really liked the difference between sort of the last year's one versus this year's one. You're right, it's a lot more complex with the different colours, but it really sort of speaks to the fact that clinicians are moving away from the categories of relapsing, remitting, primary, progressive. But there are a couple of questions that relate to that, if I can. One of them was any updates on treating primary progressive MS, and the other was there any discussion about drugs for secondary progressive MS?
Yeah,
which I know, again, you did touch on a little bit, so it was more if you had more detail, really.
I think it's always good to go through it. And I think there's some interesting things here around, going back to our discussion on language, and I think more and more we a little bit want to shift away from relapsing, remitting, secondary progressive, primary progressive, because they can potentially cause us more problems than they do good. It's traditionally, again, and unsurprisingly, like when you look at, just as an aside, looking at those graphs, life was so much easier for me as a 20-year-old when I just had this very nice, simple graph to look at. That's a very nice link to life in general. But scientists love being able to categorize. And so there is a nice, easy thing, especially when we look at clinical trials and how we do this, of saying a person is relapsing or remitting. But we know it has impacts on treatment access, certainly, because things are listed as this is only a treatment for relapsing or remitting MS. Now we know that even if a person has transitioned to secondary progressive, if there's still inflammation, those treatments can still be possible. Anyway, they weren't the questions necessarily that were asked.
I know, but it's so important, Brett. And I can't
There's
stress how much of an eye-opener this was to me. And I know somebody asked about mental health as well, and you touched on that, but the idea of anxiety, and Rebecca McGuire from Ireland she's also a researcher in MS that also lives with MS. And I know she did a podcast with you, which is really accessible, and I think it's on all the podcast places. But that ECTRIMS one, I would really recommend it if anybody wants to listen to that, because it's easy to listen to and she's easy to understand. But the idea of kind of not thinking about, am I RMS? Am I like, because I know I live with that anxiety. Am I moving into, is there progression happening? Is this my MRIs have all been stable. I have never had a relapse. And yet, is there something that's changing here? Is this just aging? Is this what's going on here? And so I think the idea of kind of like walking away from those categorizations, it was such an eye-opener to hear neurologists talking about that and looking at different typologies and thinking about, is this one disease broadly instead of kind of organizing us into these categories. I think it was so important. And the other thing that I took away, which I think is what you're about to say, Brett, is around this idea of Consempa and Ocrevus, that these drugs, or whatever they're called in the place that you are, but that these drugs have a broader reach, so that they might have the best outcomes in terms of progression, because so much of the conference was talking about progression independent of relapse activity, or PIRA. And we talked about smoldering, which is interesting in Spain because they don't have a Spanish word for smoldering, but we did talk about that at the patient day as well. And so how do we think about kind of this progression that's just happening in the background, these weird things that are happening to me on a day-to-day basis, where when I look over 5 years, I might see a difference, but I've never really had any relapses. So thinking about that, I think listening to that part was really helpful for decreasing anxiety for me. And I know everybody's different, but for me, not needing to worry about that, like, am I going to go into this place, really was so meaningful.
I
Yeah,
think
no,
it encourages, sorry, Brett,
no.
I think something also about recognizing that everybody's MS is different. So it's the fact actually having this almost moving away from the classifications is a sign of how much more we know than when those classifications first came out. And it was easy to just sort of put people, you're in this bucket, you're in that bucket. Whereas actually, if there's all these different things going on, that actually people are more likely to be treated as individuals and looking at what is actually happening for you as a person, rather than going, well, this is the journey that you're on, whether you like it or not. I think it's got to be a more positive way of looking at things. Sorry, Brett, over to you.
Well, no, and I think that links, and this was a big topic at the conference that I didn't mention during, but there is a huge push to shift towards a more personalized medicine approach in MS. And that's not just from a language mindset. I think we've talked a lot about how important that is from a language and mindset perspective, but also from a medical treatment perspective. We now have huge databases around the world that have been collecting clinical data on people living with MS for a really long time. And sort of, I guess, paradoxically, the fact that we can look at so many different people means that we can almost do a better job of looking at the individual, because now, we're not quite there yet, but we're hoping to shift over the next few years to a point where we can take a person and say, okay, well, based on all of the information that we've recorded over the past 10, 15, 20 years, this is our best guess in terms of what your future with MS looks like. And so this is what we think for you. This is the best treatment that you should go on now. These are the other things that you should be looking at. All of that work can be done now. 20 years ago, it was
It
you've
wasn't
got
an
MS,
option.
have some brochures and
Yeah.
decide what you think might be best based on, we've changed a lot, but it's trying to focus more on that individual. And then, that obviously takes in, there's a lot of lifestyle things that and individual things that need to be brought into those discussions. Where are you at in life? Are you, is career a big focus? Do you want to be traveling? Are you going to start a family? All of those things be put into this discussion so that then you can, stir it all around and work out, what is then the best thing for this. And I think that's coming back also to what you're talking about, Karen, in terms of, the mental health side of things and the anxiety that comes along with this, having an idea of, this isn't a lucky dip where we're just pulling something out and hoping for the best, but we're now shifting to, and so I should say that that's how things had to be, because we just didn't have the information that we have now, right? We're building this evidence base, but
Absolutely.
being able to have someone sit down and talk to you, and lots of people sit down and talk to you across all of these different areas and say, we think this is going to be the best, and having that as a two-way conversation is huge.
More options for treatments, that are that are disease modifying treatments, and also just lifestyle modifying treatments. Like there's so many more things. I think too, Rebecca in her anxiety piece, and I'm going to add one more thing because I know we're coming right to the end, but it was really interesting to listen to her and how she talked about stigma that people live with whenever they're disclosing their MS diagnosis. And so interesting to me to even think about how are you going to disclose, and who do you need to disclose to, and who don't you want to disclose to? And for anybody that's here today, this is my first time actually disclosing myself. So I'm not open about this to people that I work with. And if they see this and if they watch it, then that's great. But this is just where I am in my journey. And it was really, really interesting to listen to the anxiety that causes. And what do we hold back? Do we hold back on bladder symptoms because we don't want to share that with somebody, but we will say our diagnosis? Or are we okay with physical things but not cognitive things? So many pieces like that, and I think that sometimes those get left out when we're working with MS nurses who are particularly, and in Canada they're entirely around disease modifying therapies, and specifically drug companies. So there's that. The other thing that I wanted to say, and this comes off of what you're saying too, Brett, around all of this is so different than when you were 20, and here we are now, and people are living for much longer, and they're living for much longer without disability. And one of the sessions that I went to, Alex, I think you were there too, was around treatments for menopause. So we know that this is a gender disease, that it's different in men and women and how they experience things, and certainly around things like having children and going through perimenopause and through menopause. And it was interesting listening to the researchers, because they were saying that they were so focused on disability before that never before have they had women starting to tell them that they have menopause. But now that women aren't as disabled at the age of 55, now they're starting to talk about menopause. And it just made me realize how much sometimes it's difficult to be listened to, or it's difficult for healthcare practitioners to listen to people, because I bet all of those women that were also disabled were also having symptoms of menopause in addition to the disability that they were feeling. So it was really interesting, and there's lots of good work that's happening around menopause in terms of looking at, should there be some gynecologists that are also working in this neurology space so that they can look at how these work together. So just a little plug for anybody that is in a perimenopausal stage with me, that good things are coming.
I think that's really important. I think, we haven't touched much on sort of lifestyle modifications since today. We've touched on it a little bit, but that's obviously the living well is the topic of the vast majority of our webinars and podcasts. And I think I was really, really warmed. I found it so positive, the sheer quantity of discussions and presentations and gender topics on the topic of lifestyle. But I think it's the sort of moving on to the living well is more than just the pillars of the Overcoming MS program. It's menopause, it is your sex life, it is whether you disclose whether you have MS at work because you're concerned that it might impact on a promotion or even employment in general. It's all these different dimensions. And I think that the representation, Brett, you touched on the nurses' sessions and when they were talking about things like shared decision making, and even some of the presentations about trials and just talking about listening to people with MS a lot more. I do think that message was coming through really strongly. One of the questions, and I'm really sorry we've run out of time for the ends of the questions. There were just a couple that we didn't quite get onto. One of the questions was about clinical trials, and we will reshare the slide that Brett had around clinical trials. And we'll be sharing some information from Overcoming MS around how to access or find out about lifestyle trials that might affect you as well early in the new year. But we'll share that. The slides will come around. I do think there was some really positive messaging coming out of ECTRIMS, a lot of work in progress, but just the sheer volume of presentations and conversations about lifestyle, far more inclusion of people with MS. I do think it's a positive point to end on, that it's definitely sort of the up direction and a lot to feel positive about.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think this is, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to go to ECTRIMS for, I think Berlin in 2018 was the first one I went to. So I'm a bit of a seasoned pro at walking around the venue and stuff now and trying to get through the conference. But it's very different now in terms of those topics and representation in the program. And I think if I was to say one thing about that, that is because of the voice of people living with MS. Those changes don't happen necessarily because, I mean, researchers are obviously keen to talk about the things that are there, but I think this is hugely a push because of the MS community has made it very clearly known that as much as they're interested in the basic science and they want new treatments and they want to understand the disease better, they also want things that are going to help them here and now. And that's symptom management, that's lifestyle factors, and the research community, the healthcare community have listened to that, and it's now a big focus of the conference. And so that means keep shouting from the rooftops about things that are important for you, because that leads to change and it leads to it being discussed at this huge research conference, and it means then we can talk about it during the patient community day event.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. A huge thank you, Brett and Karen, for your time for today's webinar. For both of you, there were some very positive comments about you and the value of your contributions, and Karen for your expertise, along with sort of representation of someone with MS, giving your insight, and Brett, just for the amount of detail you were able to give us. So we'll send those comments on to you as well, so that you can feel good about yourselves. For everybody who's watching, hopefully you enjoyed the session. You'll receive a link to access the recording via Zoom next week, and you'll be able to find it on the Overcoming MS website and our YouTube channel as well as past webinars if we have whetted your appetite and you want to go back and see any more. Thank you very much to Jake, who's been doing a fabulous job supporting us in the background with everybody's questions and facilitating that for us. So as I mentioned, this is our final webinar of the year. Thank you to everyone who's joined us in 2025. We will be back in 2026 for season 7. I feel like a TV sitcom or something very cool, and introducing you to some sort of new hot topics in MS. So we will let you know as soon as we've got the final dates for those, and make sure you register as soon as registration is open. Finally, just as a reminder, when you exit today's webinar, please do fill out the short survey. Really, really helpful, because then at least we've got the feedback and we can see who's on the webinars, the types of topics you're wanting to hear about, and helps us report back on their impact. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Brett. Take care over the holiday season, and hopefully see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks.